Hello and welcome to the Vol Performance Online Workshop Series. Thanks for joining us today. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Jonathon Weakly with us today presenting on velocity-based training. For those of you who don't know Jono, he's currently a lecturer and researcher at ACU and works out of their Brisbane campus. I'm sure most of you will have seen a recent paper that Jono released on velocity-based training, the practical applications and recommendations, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Jono today. Jono, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sal. Thanks, and thanks to Val for inviting me to be involved, mate.
Perfect. Now I'm just going to make you host so you can share your screen and share the presentation, and then we'll have a few questions for you at the end of your presentation.
Cool. All right. Hey, so thanks again for having me. And my name's Jonathon Weakly. I'm a lecturer at Australian Catholic University. Fortunately, I've also been associated with Leeds Beckett University as Associate Research Fellow. And I'm also fortunate to be involved with a few clubs around the world. And that's the sort of stuff I really like, because as we get into sports science, everything we do should be very applied and very practical. And for me, probably the most practical topic in resistance training at the moment is velocity-based training. But I guess probably, most people kind of see velocity-based training and they probably see the finished product and they probably see what's on Twitter. So probably when we flick over to Twitter, it's, that we can zoom into my profile and you see this, these tweets and the finished article. But probably before we see the finished article, I quite often like giving a bit of a backstory. And obviously the papers that you publish don't just kind of go from 0 to 100 and they're submitted in a whole lot of fancy little graphs. But I think this velocity-based training paper was particularly interesting for me because it gave me the opportunity to work with a group of very well regarded researchers and practitioners. So we had Professor Brian Mann, Dr. Harry Banyard, Dr. Sean McLaren, Dr. Tanner Scott, and Professor Amador Garcia Ramos. And it was a real pleasure to work with these guys because they are truly experts in the field, and they're additionally they're also expert practitioners. So before we had the finished product, you kind of got to start at the beginning. And when this paper came to me, it was I was a postdoctoral candidate, and I remember I was sitting over in England and the United Kingdom, and I came across this great paper by Pereira Blanco from 2017, and I just remember just being absolutely blown away by it. And I remember spending a lot of my time just looking at these results and just thinking, wow, what a paper. They were taking muscle biopsies and they were looking at how they could moderate the adaptive responses, and they could do it by being more precise with their training. And then I realized that actually in practice, we were doing a lot of velocity-based training. We were providing feedback, which was often called velocity-based training. We were monitoring adaptations, which was called velocity-based training. I was periodizing all my rugby players with velocity-based training and monitoring their day-to-day fatigue and adaptations with velocity-based training. And I remember sitting down and talking about velocity-based training to a lot of people, and then a lot of people would say to me, "Oh, so you do velocity-based training?" And then I'd kind of sit there and pause and I'd think, yeah, I guess I do velocity-based training, but it's quite a strange question for me because no one ever says do you do percentage-based training? Or it's kind of like saying, do you do apples? And you kind of go, well, yeah, I eat apples. I put them in my cooking. I might make a juice out of them. But do I do apples? It's such a vague concept. And then I remember sitting in my little Leeds apartment one night, and it was raining as all hell as anything, and I was tapping away at the computer. And then I remember thinking to myself, why don't we do a paper which actually clarifies a lot of these things? Why don't we do a paper which has some of the best practitioners in the world and some of the best researchers in the world? And why don't we come together and why don't we develop a paper that actually covers what velocity-based training is and kind of takes you from A to Z. It kind of takes you from, the first steps into velocity-based training and to being able to how to implement it fully into your training programs. And then when we started to come together as a group, and I was very fortunate to be able to previously know people like Amador Garcia Ramos, who's excellent in the velocity-based training space. And I remember reaching out to these guys, and they were just so excited and so keen to be able to contribute to this paper. And for me personally, they were the true experts in their own respective areas, and it seemed like such a natural fit. But as I delved into it and I was writing the introduction of the paper, I remember thinking, well, people don't know what velocity-based training is. And probably this sentence here is probably the most important sentence I'll probably ever write in academia, or in any research paper at least. And the reason for that is because it's the definition of what velocity-based training is. So velocity-based training is a method that uses velocity to inform or enhance training practice. And I think that's hugely important, because before you can actually utilize velocity-based training, we need to be able to define what it is. Additionally, we need to understand why velocity. Because realistically, coaches are interested in things like power. So why not power-based training? Because that would be exciting, you know, kind of training athletes to be more powerful. We want powerful athletes. No coach has ever said we don't want powerful athletes. Or alternatively, we could say, why not force-based training? We can make it, space age, use the force. Alternatively, all the researchers who are so excited about ground reaction forces and rate of force development. So why not force? And why velocity? Well, we then also needed to explain to researchers and practitioners why velocity. And probably the three basic tenets which that underpin velocity-based training are that we know that as the bar gets heavier, the bar goes slower. And there's a nearly perfect inverse relationship. So as you put more weight on and get closer to your 1RM, the bar's going to go slower and slower and slower. Additionally, we also know that as you get to your 1RM, there's what we call a terminal velocity threshold. And that terminal velocity threshold is the speed the bar travels at when you are pushing your 1RM. And it doesn't matter if it's you and me, or if it's your father and your mother, or your younger sibling, or a friend next door. We all push the bar at your 1RM at approximately the same speed. So what we now know is that, first of all, the bar goes slower as it gets heavier. And on top of that, we can then start to estimate how close you are to your 1RM. And additionally, and this is kind of obvious, this third one is, as you exercise, you become fatigued. And as fatigue accrues, the barbell slows down. So we can also monitor fatigue as you exercise. And with power-based training and force-based training, you couldn't do that, because force-based training would be dictated by the mass on the bar, and power-based training is related to force. But velocity, you can do it, and you can compare across multiple people. So additionally, building upon defining it and explaining why we needed to use velocity over other kinetical kinematic factors, we started to think, well, we need to also explain what velocity-based training is. And velocity-based training is so many different things to so many different people. So first of all, you could have something simple like providing feedback. Feedback is almost the basics of being a coach. And we know that if you provide just basic velocity feedback, you can enhance your motivation, you can enhance your competitiveness. We also know that we can improve the training outputs during training from an acute standpoint. So we know that if we are providing the athletes feedback, their training quality is better. And additionally, on the top right here, you can also see that over periods of time of improving their motivation and competitiveness and improving the acute training quality of the athlete, we can actually improve the adaptation and the adaptive response. So better training over long periods of time mean better adaptations. Now, we also know that we can assess adaptations with velocity. So we could monitor if an athlete is improving over time. People have been doing this for decades. And you can see here in the study that we did with different types of barbells, or hex bars versus barbell jump squats, we can see that we monitored athletes before and after. And this is really exciting, because traditionally in resistance training, we've just monitored 1RM performance, so their maximal performance. But realistically, in a game like AFL or rugby union or rugby league, no one jumps on your back and just goes, right, 1RM on his back, go. No, people might jump on your back and go, and they're a set load. And you need to be able to express power and velocity with a set load. So we can now start to monitor the load-velocity relationship. And that's really exciting. It's not just about being able to push the maximal load. It's how fast you can push a load submaximally, which is also important. Additionally, we also know that we can monitor fatigue and adaptation. And you can see here an example where we've been monitoring athletes over a period of time, and then we monitored their adaptation across a training phase. And we see this, and we've been doing this with professional teams recently. And it's almost like the optimal form of monitoring, invisible monitoring. The reason for this is because they're working out, and instead of having to get them to do counter movement jumps and plyometric push-ups or subjective well-being, and you can still do all these sorts of things, but at the start of every training session, why don't we just make the test of fatigue or adaptation as specific as we can, and just get them to do maybe a squat or a bench press with a predefined set load, and the players already know what that training load is, and they just go, right, I'm just going to warm up, and then I'm going to put the load on the bar, do a couple of reps, and we can just monitor those the velocity output over time. And if you know the bar gets faster, you know that they're adapting. Alternatively, you also know if they're starting to get slower with that predefined set load, that they're probably going to be overtrained and fatigued, or perhaps detraining. So it's a really easy way to monitor them over time. Additionally, we can calculate the daily 1RM. And this is really exciting because we know that athletes often don't like 1RM testing. It's quite stressful. We also know it induces a lot of fatigue. And we know that it takes a lot of time. So the more time that we're testing and reducing the stimulus on the athlete, the more time we're not training. So then people like Amador Garcia Ramos have done this excellent work where we've been able to estimate the 1RM very quick and very easily with very, very small amounts of fatigue. And it's really accurate too. So being able to utilize velocity, we can estimate the 1RM daily if we want to. So alternatively, as we progress down this continuum and start to utilize more velocity, we can also start to utilize velocity for training and prescribing. And this is where we're probably going to really delve into. And I'm a simple man. I like simple things. So when I think about training, I often think about the external stimulus, how that influences the internal response, and how that then causes an adaptive outcome. So for me, this is really where my research started getting really interesting over the last few years. I started looking into things called relative velocity loss thresholds. And if you apply a relative velocity loss threshold, you can control the intensity and the volume of training that an athlete does. So first of all, we know that velocity is constant. If you move at 0.6, well, guess what? You can come back another day and train at 0.6. Alternatively, if you want to make the bar heavier and you want to train at a lower speed, you can train at 0.5. But the great thing about velocity is because it's constant, you can control for fatigue and adaptation. So that means you always know what you're training. So it doesn't matter if you're training on the field and when you come in and go into the gym. It doesn't matter if you've got gym first and then you go into the field. Because we can start controlling for the fatigue within and across sessions. We also know that as you get stronger across mesocycles, and let's hope that we all do, the intensities that you're prescribing with stay the same because guess what? You're training off the velocity. So we can actually start to prescribe the intensities that we want now with velocity. And by doing this, we can start to control for the starting speed, and by adding a relative velocity loss threshold, we can allow different athletes who have different muscular endurance characteristics to fatigue at different rates, but also control the fatigue that they're inducing. So let's say if we applied a 20% velocity loss threshold on a 0.7 initial barbell starting speed, we can have an endurance athlete compared to a sprinter, and a sprinter might produce a different, they might complete a different number of repetitions than an endurance athlete. But that's okay, because we know that endurance athletes have different physiological underpinnings, and that they are more endurance by nature. So they may be able to endure multiple repetitions better than a sprinter who might fatigue faster. So with a 20% velocity loss threshold, and we can see this here, we had two different athletes, an endurance athlete and a sprinter. And you can see that these athletes did very, very different numbers of repetitions. But when we started to look at their fatigue response, they were identical. Now, we also know that it's okay for athletes to be different, and we should embrace this in sports science. In sports science, historically, we've been actually quite poor at controlling and allowing for differences between athletes, because you wouldn't prescribe the same thing for an endurance athlete and a sprinter on the field. So why do we do it in the gym? So we know now that if we can control for the velocity loss threshold, we can embrace their differences. And it's true, they may have to complete different numbers of repetitions, but that's okay, because you're inducing the same amount of fatigue. And you can see here, when you apply different velocity loss thresholds, athletes will complete very different amounts of repetitions. Say, for example, in the 20% condition, an athlete might complete 20 repetitions, and another athlete might complete 55 repetitions. And in this example, this was exactly what happened with the sprinter and the endurance athlete. So we're allowing the external load to be dictated by their different characteristics. And as you can see here, when we apply velocity-based training and we control for the amount of velocity loss, we can very, very closely control for the amount of power they're producing here on the left and the velocity as they train. However, when you start to compare velocity-based training with percentage-based training, you can really start to see the differences. With velocity-based training, the intensity or the average set velocity stays the same as they train. So you can see here 0.63 across 3 sets. However, when you implement percentage-based training and you're not controlling for the fatigue that's accruing as they train, the barbell gets slower and slower and slower. So we know with velocity-based training, we can start prescribing an intensity and we can keep that barbell at the same speed, which means that the intensity stays the same across the whole session. Because when you prescribe a training intensity, let's say 70%, and the barbell, and as fatigue accrues and the barbell becomes slower and slower and slower, well, the barbell is technically kind of getting heavier, isn't it? It's because you're fatigued and the barbell feels heavier as you're training. A classic example of this would be you're not as fresh on your 10th set as you are on your first set. Well, velocity-based training helps to control for that. And we can show you what I mean in the internal responses. So as we delve into the internal responses, we can see here that neuromuscular fatigue can be controlled for by applying different velocity loss thresholds. So you can see the 10%, the 20% and the 30%, and the red, blue, and green respectively, they induce different amounts of fatigue across a session. And this is very linear if you look at it. Additionally, we can start to control for the metabolic response, so the blood response, so the lactate response in the blood. And we can start to again see it's a very linear response between the 3 different conditions. The next thing we can see is that if we apply different velocity loss thresholds, we can control for their perceived response, how hard the athletes perceive the training session. And we can keep the training intensity relatively consistent across the session. And we also know, and this is probably the thing that most amazes me about velocity-based training, is that as the athletes are training and you put a velocity loss threshold, you induce a given fatigue response and a given internal response. However, when you are applying velocity loss thresholds, you are training them based off their fatigue, and you are training them to induce a certain amount of fatigue. And the great thing about this is that velocity doesn't change. So in this example here, we asked athletes to train, and we got them to do 10, 20, and 30% velocity loss thresholds in the back squat. And then we got them to go away and do whatever they wanted for 4 weeks, 4, 6, 8 weeks, it doesn't matter. The thing is the athletes go away, and some athletes might train a lot, some athletes might detrain, some athletes might sit on the couch for 4, 5, 6 weeks, it doesn't matter. And the great thing about it is that the variability in the internal response, so the metabolic, the neuromuscular, and the perceptual responses are identical. They're very, very similar to within-day and very acute reliability studies. This means that this means that the internal response across time is the same. Now, this is a really amazing thing. The reason for that is because it doesn't matter if a coach can prescribe something once. What matters is if the coach can prescribe something multiple times. Because anyone can prescribe a training session, but can you prescribe a training session and have the exact same response time and time again? Well, with velocity-based training and relative velocity loss thresholds, we can induce these same responses time and time again, irrespective of the individual, irrespective of their recent training and irrespective of their recent training history. And for me, this is absolutely mind-blowing, because this means I can be a better coach. I can prescribe intensity and prescribe an internal response that is consistent. And when you can prescribe something that is consistent, that means you can help to control the adaptive outcome. So we know that when we prescribe larger velocity loss thresholds, individuals will have to complete larger numbers of repetitions. And this great study by Pereira Blanco that has shown this across a training cycle. But when you prescribe larger velocity loss thresholds compared to smaller velocity loss thresholds, you're going to have different outcomes. So in this study by Pereira Blanco, we can see that training responses were quite disparate. So we can see here the group who did more repetitions didn't necessarily get as strong or as powerful as athletes who completed a smaller number of repetitions. However, we can see that the individuals who did a greater number of repetitions compared to a smaller number of repetitions had different changes in muscle hypertrophy or muscle volume. And we can see here that the group who did more volume, the 40% group compared to the 20% group, had almost 3 times the amount of growth in the quadricep. And probably one of the most impressive things about this study is that the 40% group and the 20% group had very different changes at the cellular level. And we can see here that the 40% group had more of a transition towards the type 1 fiber and a loss of the type 2 explosive fibers, where the 20% group managed to hold on to those type 2X fibers a bit more. So the group who did more volume ended up not being as strong or as powerful, and they had more of a change from the explosive type 2 fibers towards the more endurance-based type 1 fibers. And being able to then apply these relative velocity loss thresholds and have different adaptive outcomes, for me, is absolutely outstanding. Because for the first time, we are able to prescribe something, induce the same outcome, and then start to pinpoint where we're having different adaptive outcomes. And for a coach, this should be really exciting. The next thing we can also know is that when we are utilizing velocity-based training across a training cycle, the athletes find it easier. So if we prescribe a training relative velocity loss threshold across a training cycle, we know that athletes may be able to complete less repetitions and have more targeted adaptive responses. But we also know that the athletes find it easier because the load is more appropriate each session, because we're accounting for fatigue and changes across the mesocycle. And in this paper from velocity-based training from theory to application, we started to put together all the adaptive outcomes we've seen in the research. And you can see that the groups, we can see on the left-hand side, we've got smaller velocity loss thresholds and how they induce different fatigue and adaptive outcomes. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the greater velocity loss thresholds and how it induces different fatigue and adaptive outcomes. So finally, it's all well and good if you can do something once and twice and you can prescribe a training session, But how does it fit within the whole training mesocycle? Well, that's quite easy. The thing is because with velocity, we can still keep basic periodization principles, and we can still apply them in a logical and systematic sequencing fashion. So with velocity-based training, there's no reason why we still can't do block periodized models. So we could apply a load and maybe apply a slightly larger velocity loss threshold. This will mean that we induce more fatigue, maybe have greater muscular endurance outcomes, and greater muscle hypertrophy. After that first mesocycle, we could transition into a second strength mesocycle where we know that the load is heavier, we induce slightly smaller amounts of fatigue, and we induce more strength adaptations. And finally, we could move into a power-based mesocycle where we have very, very small amount of fatigue being induced, but we can also prescribe at the intensity that we want to. And the great thing about this is that it doesn't matter if you've been in the gym first or previously in the day. It doesn't matter if you've been on the field in the day. It just means that we can train at the intensity that we want and control the volume to a better extent. Again, you could apply a linear periodized model, and you could just make the load go heavier week after week after week, and you could apply a simple 20% velocity loss threshold, or a 10 or a 30. But in this example, we've done a 20% velocity loss threshold, and you can see here that as the load gets heavier on average across the weeks, the volume decreases. And this just follows traditional periodized models and traditional periodized principles. Again, we could utilize a daily undulating periodized model, or a DUP mesocycle, and you could have a strength and power day, you could have a power day, and you could have a strength endurance or hypertrophy day. And it just means that we have greater control over our training intensities and training volumes. So for the first time, we have been able to prescribe an intensity and control for the volume, but also control for the fatigue that's being induced within the session, between athletes, within athletes, and across the mesocycle. And this can be work within any traditional periodized model. It's not VBT versus percentage-based training. It's how VBT can work with all the physiology and all the traditional knowledge that we know, but how we can make it better by prescribing to a better extent. So from me, the take home is that we know that athletes fatigue at different rates during training, and we should be able to embrace this. But historically in sports science, we haven't embraced this very well at all. We also know that athletes require different amounts of a given stimulus. So an athlete like an endurance runner, they might need more volume to induce a given response, and that's okay. They're an endurance runner. Alternatively, you might have a sprinter who might need smaller volumes with different intensities, but that's okay as well. We can control for this. We know that athletes have different physiological characteristics. Some athletes, again, might be more endurance, some might be more explosive or strength orientated, and that's okay. We should be able to embrace this. And we also know that athletes generate different amounts of fatigue between sessions because they are different. But with velocity-based training, we know that we can prescribe the load irrespective of the fatigue because the intensity on the bar very, very perfectly, or nearly perfectly, matches barbell velocity. So we can match the barbell velocity with a relative intensity. We also know that we can train and target specific physiological characteristics and mitigate unnecessary fatigue responses by applying relative velocity loss thresholds. We also know with velocity-based training, we can improve motivation and competitiveness and enhance acute training outputs. The next thing we also know with velocity-based training is that we can have specific physiological outcomes that can be replicated over time. With traditional percentage-based training, we often test them at the start of a mesocycle and then again at the end, but we don't account for what's going on between. But with velocity, we can control for these differences. Finally, we also know that we can develop training programs that actually train at intensities that we want. In resistance training, we often argue about semantics. Oh, I'm training at this intensity today. I'm training at 76. Well, you're training at 77%, so we can't train together. Well, with velocity-based training, we can actually control for those small differences. And with traditional forms of training where you test at the start of a mesocycle, often athletes become more fatigued or they adapt throughout a mesocycle, particularly if it's a long mesocycle, let's say 6 weeks. However, with velocity-based training, we account for those differences in fatigue and those changes across the mesocycle. That means that if we're training at 80%, that means we're training at 80%. It doesn't matter if you're fatigued. It doesn't matter if you're adapting. It doesn't matter if you're getting more fatigue during the session compared to your training partner. It doesn't matter. We can mitigate those differences by modifying the load, and that can be dictated by the velocity of the barbell. So there's quite a big overview of the paper and everything that we included in that paper, from velocity-based training from theory to application. Please feel free to reach out at any point. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, and you can email me or reach me out on Twitter. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jono. That's fantastic information and a fantastic insight into what's been a lot of work for you over the last couple of years.
Yeah, definitely.
So you touched on using VBT to monitor as possibly a mode within a strength and power program. When you talk about that squat or bench press at fixed loads, what's your recommendations there in that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think to zoom out, mate, and like, you're on the floor day to day still, and you know how important it is to make sure you're on top of adaptation, fatigue responses, and making sure that you're not wasting time with the athletes. You've only got a couple of hours each day with the athletes, and you kind of almost milk every single second with them. And I think for me personally, I'm a big believer that if you're going to test something, it's got to be able to be utilized for training prescription, monitoring, whether that's fatigue or adaptation, or being able to rank an athlete. So, hey, player A is better than player B. And for me personally, I think that monitoring athletes has to be very specific for the sport that you're doing. There's nothing worse than training athletes and then monitoring them with something that they never do. Let's say, doing a plyometric push-up for a cyclist. It's kind of like, how does that relate? But we also know that in team sports or athletes across different sports, they often resistance train, or at least they should. And the thing is that we can easily do invisible monitoring and implement traditional so we can easily assess fatigue and adaptation across the training cycle in almost an invisible fashion. So this could be in an AFL player. We know that they're probably going to squat once or twice a week, and you can put a predefined load on the barbell, and you might have a specific load that you feel is relevant, and whatever load that is, as long as you keep it consistent, you can actually just monitor their training adaptations or fatigue responses across time. For a powerlifter in their example there, that was a 100 kilogram squat, which is actually relatively light for a powerlifter, of course. But for an AFL player, it might be a 40 kilogram bench press and a 60 kilogram squat. And we know that if we can control for the noise, the fluctuations in daily variation, and people like Sean McLaren have done a great job kind of whipping that diagram together and explaining it really thoroughly in the paper. But we can kind of start to account for the daily fluctuations in fatigue and the noise as such. And then we can also start to put on little thresholds of what is considered a worthwhile change. And then we can kind of start to do some statistical approaches that starts to quantify the likelihood that changes have happened. And the great thing about this form of monitoring is that we can make it specific to you and your player's cell. We can make it specific to the Brisbane Broncos or the Queensland Reds. It doesn't matter. The thing is as long as we've got a predefined load, you can monitor them across time, and you can start to see how they're adapting, or scary if they're not adapting, or they're getting fatigue and detraining. And so it's really, really simple. As long as the boys or the players in your team know what load they're going to do, they know at the start of every session you're just going to do 2 or 3 reps. You're going to you've got a gym aware system or something that you can record the velocities. It's easy. You can just whap it into a spreadsheet, and away you go. So it's really super simple, and it's almost like invisible monitoring.
Yeah, Yeah, no, there's definitely been a lot of talk recently around the benefits of invisible monitoring using GPS and other forms of technology. What about the, I guess, issues where maybe you have athletes who are box squatting to different depths and how that may impact on their terminal velocity threshold when you are working at those higher percentages?
Mate, and that's such a good question. And the cool thing is there's been actually quite a lot of research in that sort of area. Like, so we know, for example, that if you do different exercises, there are differences in the terminal velocity threshold. So, for example, in the back squat in relatively trained athletes, so let's say an AFL player, their back squat terminal threshold will be about 0.25. And there's a little bit of noise in there, just depending on the athlete and where they're at and things like that. But we're talking 0.02 kind of meters per second, very, very small amounts. With a box squat, it might be that the threshold is slightly higher. And the thing is, so let's say 0.29. So we're still talking very, very similar barbell velocities at the 1RM. And the thing is as long as you know that, and the athlete is training with that pretty consistently, they're not just doing one-off and testing the box squat and then going away and doing, training with a normal squat, which would be a bit strange. You probably won't see that in practice. But the thing is if they are testing with, if they're training with a box, the thing is you just modify that terminal velocity threshold. And so when you're estimating the 1RM, you just put that terminal threshold in and draw a line between the two and get that speed, and away you go. So I think the main thing is establishing that terminal threshold. And in the paper, there was a little table in the presentation which outlined the actual 1RMs of all these different exercises. You can pretty much just take that threshold from the paper, plug it into your spreadsheet, and away you go. So it's as long as you know the terminal threshold and you have 2 or 3 points, you can draw a line between them, and you've got the 1RM pretty accurately.
Yeah, and the other question around the use of VBT, when you spoke about the sprinters versus the endurance athletes, is there a way that you could utilize it to better understand athletes' physiological characteristics? So you spoke about more reps possibly with the endurance athlete.
Yeah.
Do you,
Mate, I completely understand. Like, I remember one time I presented to CrossFit. Now, hate it or love it, CrossFit is what it is. And, I might go in my office later on and have people, surrounding me with stakes and burning pitchforks and all those sorts of things. And I think CrossFit's a really cool sport. Personally, I think the athletes are amazing. And one thing about CrossFit is they have phenomenal endurance capacity. They're really strong and they're really fit. The thing is that they have very different physiological characteristics than, say, a powerlifter. And I remember presenting to CrossFitters, and they were really intrigued by this velocity-based training kind of concept. And I said to them, well, CrossFit's all about doing multiple reps with a certain load. So why don't we train them and put on a really good threshold, like a big threshold or a small threshold, or whatever sort of threshold or characteristic that you want to train, and train with the intensity and try and induce greater endurance characteristics with a set before you hit a terminal velocity. Before you hit a relative velocity threshold. And we can start to induce those muscle adaptations with a given load that you want. Alternatively, you could look at multiple athletes. You might have a prop in rugby who's a real big, strong, explosive type. You might have a nippy halfback who's got really good endurance characteristics. And you can actually compare their endurance characteristics with a set relative intensity. You could say, okay, guys, we're going to see how many repetitions you could do before you hit a velocity loss threshold. And I think there's a really interesting way to train athletes, and it's a really good way to kind of have a better understanding. Is this athlete got really good muscular endurance? Is this athlete maybe needing to induce greater muscular endurance adaptations? And absolutely, I think it's really cool. Probably just building upon that, and to kind of throw the cat amongst the pigeons, a lot of these things also depend upon the state that they're in. If they've got lots of fatigue in their body, they mightn't be able to produce a lot of repetitions. Alternatively, if they've had a lot of carbohydrates or they're coming in super flat, maybe their ability to produce high intensity efforts over and over again might be mitigated. So again, that's probably one of the strengths of velocity loss thresholds. we can actually start to prescribe volumes depending upon how they are that day. So we don't only get a really good understanding of the athlete, we're starting to account for all these little things like sleep and food consumption and all those sorts of like fatigue responses and all that.
Do you think that athletes need to be at a certain relative strength level before you apply certain velocity loss thresholds where they're just not going to get the adaptive response because they're just actually not strong enough yet? Or
yeah, man, it's mate, I think there's a bit of discussion about that. Now, first of all, it's just like anything, mate. I think you need to have a certain level of training before you do it. And I think if you can't squat or you can't bench or you can't deadlift or something, you know, your biggest, the thing that we probably need you to focus on is getting competent in those movements. But, you know, the more I think about it, and like, don't get me wrong, I love resistance training. I love getting into the gym and lifting about 10. But the thing is that what velocity-based training does, in my opinion, is it allows you to train at a given intensity that's appropriate. It allows you to complete volumes which are appropriate. So if you want to implement appropriate training into your program, as long as they are competent in the lift and they're not sacrificing their training quality just to try and hit these arbitrary numbers, I think training with appropriate loads is a really good thing to do. And I think training with appropriate volumes is an appropriate thing to do. So personally, I think once they're competent, once they understand the benefits of it, and that we're about chasing training quality rather than chasing just random numbers, I think realistically, you can start to implement VBT at any point. And it's like almost like a gateway drug. You can just start providing feedback to the athletes as they're training to get them used to it. I remember I coached adolescent athletes for years and years and years, you know, like just the moment we started implementing feedback of their velocity, you could start to see these youth athletes starting to engage a little bit more with the resistance training. They felt like it was a bit more of a game, and they were kind of starting to go, oh, hey, I'm really going to try and hit these numbers. And it was almost like they were kind of starting to understand the numbers. If I try hard, the numbers go up, and that's a good thing. I hear that little ding. And I think once they were competent and once they were able to, you know, train appropriately and safely, you know, providing feedback is what good coaches do. So being able to prescribe better intensities, more appropriate intensities and more appropriate volumes, probably everyone's a winner there. But yeah, as you're probably saying there is a level. You got to be competent. You can't just be chasing numbers for numbers' sake. But I think, I think it all makes sense once you kind of put it like that.
And when we are prescribing intensity zones or velocity zones, what's the ideal kind of range? If I'm looking to develop max strength, am I using a 0.1 range, 0.2 range? What would that look like?
Yeah, so mate, it's such a good question, bro. And I think realistically, each exercise again has a terminal threshold. So let's say the bench pull, that's about 0.47 or 0.48. And the thing is for a squat, that might be 0.25. And a bench press, the lowest I've ever seen is about 0.1. And we know that if you want to get strong, you got to lift heavy weights, right? And the thing is if you train at an intensity kind of like 80 to 90%, you know that you're probably going to have more appropriate strength adaptations. So the thing is that, let's say if we're training with a deadlift or a bench press, you know, we're still going to try and train at those intensities. We're just going to match it up with a velocity. So that might be saying, okay, for the deadlift guys, we're going to train anything below 0.35 as your training repetitions. Hey, but we also don't want to train you. We also don't want to allow you to train to failure. So anything below 0.2, no more. Cut it, you know, have a break, have a rest. That's cool. And if someone, you and me might train together, and I'm pretty unfit at the moment, so let's be honest. So the thing is that I think realistically, you might hit 6 reps and I might hit 4, but you hit 0.2 and I hit 0.2. Hey, that's okay. We're both fatigued, mate. We're both getting close to failure. But the thing is that you're fitter than me, so you're accounting for that fatigue, and you might just do 1 or 2 more reps. It's because you can tolerate it. So it kind of comes down to the exercise that you're doing. It kind of comes down to the volume that you want to complete. If you want to train into failure, absolutely, just go bananas. But the thing is that If you want to induce different amounts of fatigue, take them closer to failure or further away from failure. And if you want to induce, real strength adaptations, you might start them at a load that's closer to the terminal threshold.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. And what about your thoughts around cycling in and out the use of VBT? So, you spoke about it is really good for competitiveness and motivation, but sometimes if athletes get caught up in the data and seeing that they're not lifting the same numbers that they were the week before, they can question, they go, I feel just as good, but it's telling me I'm slower. How do you mitigate against that?
Yeah, mate. So I think as well, mate, we've got this situation where I'm going to try and speak real diplomatically here, mate. Some people kind of want to make it like a you versus us thing. You know what I mean? Like a percentage-based trainer. Sorry, man, I'm block periodized models. I can't hang with no DUPs. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, man, like, I'm a coach. I'm trying to make my athletes better. I actually don't care how I'm going to make them better. I just need to make them better. And I think you don't have to be kind of like a VBT guy. You don't have to be a block periodized guy. You can use a different model if you want to. No one's making you be a linear periodized model guy or a DUP guy. And I think it's the same with velocity-based training. I've got different tools in my tool belt, and I just need to know when to use them. So the thing is from a coaching standpoint, for sure, I don't always utilize VBT. I utilize it when it's effective and when it's going to be, it's going to enhance my performance, my athlete's performance. So, for example, power training, I might utilize it to motivate the athletes to really drive home those forces, those powers, make the barbell move fast. And I might also utilize it before before games to really get the boys, buzzing, get the gym humming. Alternatively, during really large muscular endurance phases where I just almost want to induce maximal amounts of fatigue to induce really large muscular adaptations, I might just take the velocity away from the boys, and I might just say, guys, train to failure or close to it at least. Or I might say, squat until you hit a certain threshold. But you're coming out with different, the same outcome. It's just how you get it. And I think you got to read the room, Sal. I think it's a good coach knows their athlete. They also know when to use feedback, and they also know when not to use feedback. And I think it's I think a good coach will then be able to go, hey, this is the time to use it. For me personally, I've always got the gym awares on the barbells because I know that I can just keep an eye on more people. And I've got an iPad. I'm walking around the room and if I see something going too fast or too low, I'll shout out or go, come on, mate, like chuck some more weight on the bar, or hey, you've got to ease up. Hey, mate, you've got to be fresh for Saturday. Or alternatively, I might say, hey, let's give the boys some feedback today. Let's get them buzzing. But I think it's really, really dependent on the situation, who you are as a coach, the team you've got, all that sort of thing, mate. And I think that's where kind of like the science meets the art. And I think the best coaches can read the room, understand their athletes, know when to use the tool and when not to. It's kind of like that the basic saying of, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, VBT is just like that. You can use it or you don't have to, or you can use it in bits and pieces. But for me personally, I think there's heaps of different ways you can use it. And that's probably what this paper was all about. It kind of shows you that continuum. It says, hey, you can use it like this, you can use it like this, you can use it like this. You can go full 100% VBT, or you can go 5% VBT and just provide a little bit of feedback.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic advice, and context is key, and it is about having lots of different methods to be able to manipulate and, as you mentioned, get the adaptation you're after, or if it's more so getting engagement and motivation, then getting that as well. I really appreciate your input and your insight into this topic. You're always a wealth of knowledge. And what's next for Dr. Jonathon Weakly? What have you got going at the moment, mate, research-wise or else?
Mate, it's pretty exciting times. We're doing, we're looking to some really long-term fatigue responses. We're looking at, I can probably give you a little bit of a heads up, and we're looking at if we prescribe different velocity loss thresholds, what are the fatigue responses across time? So, we've been utilizing some pretty cool methods of monitoring fatigue, and we've actually been able to say that with different velocity loss thresholds, we can consistently induce fatigue responses, like over long periods of time, which we've probably done acute and short term. But now we're starting to go, hey, if we induce this, if we complete this training session, we can also we can consistently induce a fatigue response, and that's really important for microcycles, because I know if I'm doing a training session on Wednesday and I need them fresh by Saturday, and I do something that has really variable responses, I'm in trouble. I might lose my job if my boys running out there are really fatigued. So the thing is that I think that's really cool. We've also got, as I've probably moved back to Australia, I've been able to get a bit more involved in the local sports and things like that, and that's been really great. And we've got a group of PhD students who are doing some really good work, mate. And yeah, mate. But I think it's not just VBT for me at the moment. It's aerobic development or strength training or concurrent training or looking at adolescence. So we've got like a whole spectrum of things. And for me personally, the more I work with PhD students, the more I've kind of felt that it's much better to let them choose the topic and let them kind of do what they want to do. And then you kind of like just put your seatbelt on and just go for the ride and help guide them as much as you can. And I think the results are so much better for it, and that the student stays engaged, and it's really, really cool for me. So it's that's the thing I go into lecturing for, to work with students and see them like really progress and kind of come out with jobs that they want to do and research, and let them do research that they want. So yeah, it's been pretty cool. So
fantastic, mate. Well, we look forward to what you have coming out, and thanks again for your time today. All the best for what the future holds.
Thanks, Sal. It's good to see you, mate.
Man.
Catch up soon, brother.